The clock struck midnight, and the hum of fluorescent lights filled the empty halls of Starlight Grocery. Kayla adjusted her apron, the knot at her back tightening like the tension in her chest. Night shifts were routine now, quiet, eerie, and dotted with moments that made her question if she was truly alone in the store. She moved to aisle 3, where a pyramid of canned soups teetered slightly. Adjusting a can at the edge, she froze as the overhead speakers crackled to life. No music played, no announcements followed, just the static hiss that seeped into her nerves. Probably the wiring, she muttered, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her unease. She pushed her cart of stock toward the freezer section, the wheels squeaking like a faint scream. The freezers always felt colder during the night shift, their icy breath seeming to spill out into the aisle. As she began placing bags of frozen peas onto the shelves, she caught her reflection in the glass door. There was something behind her. She spun around, heart pounding. Nothing. Just row after row of gleaming tiles under the dim glow of the ceiling lights. Her breath clouded in front of her. It was unusually cold now, too cold for comfort. She considered calling Jacob, the overnight security guard, but dismissed the thought. He was probably in the back, snacking on vending machine chips and watching his grainy monitors. Kayla forced a smile, trying to steady herself. Get it together. It's just your imagination. But as she turned back to the freezer, the glass showed another reflection. It wasn't hers. A pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes stared out from inside the freezer. Its lips were pressed tight, almost angry, and frost rimmed its sunken cheeks. Kayla gasped, stumbling backward, her hand knocking over a row of frozen pizzas. She looked again, but it was gone. She grabbed her radio, her voice shaking. "Jacob, are you there? Static. Jacob, answer me!" A low crackle responded, followed by a whisper, almost too faint to hear. "Turn around." Her blood ran cold. She dropped the radio and bolted toward the front of the store. The shelves seemed to stretch endlessly as her sneakers slapped against the floor, her breath shallow and rapid. The entrance doors were locked, the automatic sliders refusing to budge even as she slammed her hands against the glass. Come on, she cried, glancing over her shoulder. The aisle behind her was empty. No phantom, no shadowy figure. Nothing but her reflection in the door. She looked closer. Her reflection didn't mimic her movements. It stood still, staring at her with lifeless eyes, a cruel smile spreading across its face. Then it raised a hand and pointed. Not at her. Behind her. Kayla screamed and turned, but the aisle was still empty. She stumbled backward, her chest heaving, and the store lights flickered. Darkness swallowed the room for a brief second before the lights buzzed back to life. The reflection was gone. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. It was dead, the battery inexplicably drained. The speakers above crackled again, this time spilling out the distorted notes of a music box tune. The sound echoed through the store, a slow and haunting melody that twisted her stomach. She couldn't stay here. "Jacob, where the hell are you?" she shouted, her voice cracking as she ran toward the employee break room. The door creaked open, and she hesitated on the threshold. The break room was in disarray. Chairs were overturned, a coffee mug lay shattered on the floor, and Jacob's radio sat on the table, its screen blinking red. "Jacob?" she whispered. The locker doors along the wall rattled violently, as if something or someone was trapped inside. Kayla backed away, her pulse hammering in her ears. The room's lights flickered, and the rattling stopped. A long, pregnant silence followed. Then the locker doors creaked open, one by one, empty. All except the last one. A hand, pale and bony, reached out, its fingers curling like claws. Kayla froze, unable to move as the figure pulled itself from the locker. It was impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and its face shrouded in shadow. It moved toward her with a jerky, unnatural gait, its head tilting as if studying her. Kayla screamed and darted out of the break room, slamming the door behind her. She ran to the stockroom, the only other place Jacob could be. "Jacob, please," she cried, her voice breaking. The stockroom was dimly lit, rows of towering shelves casting eerie shadows. Her footsteps echoed as she navigated the narrow paths, calling Jacob's name. She rounded a corner and froze. Jacob was there, but he wasn't moving. He stood with his back to her, facing the wall. His posture was rigid, his head slightly tilted, just like the figure in the break room. "Jacob?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't respond. She stepped closer, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. When she reached out to touch his shoulder, he spun around suddenly. His face was pale, his eyes wide and vacant, and his lips were sewn shut with thick black thread. Kayla stumbled back, her scream catching in her throat. Jacob raised a hand, pointing to the ceiling. Kayla followed his gesture, her eyes traveling upward. Above her, clinging to the rafters, was the thing. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, its mouth stretching into an unnatural grin. It dropped from the ceiling with a sickening thud, landing just inches from her. Kayla bolted, her legs burning as she sprinted through the stockroom and back into the store. The shelves seemed to close in around her, the aisles narrowing and twisting in impossible ways. The music box melody grew louder, disjointed notes echoing in her ears. She tripped and fell, sprawling across the cold tile. When she looked up, she was no longer in the store. The aisles were gone, replaced by an endless void of darkness. The only light came from above, a flickering bulb that barely illuminated the figure standing in front of her. It was her reflection, or what was left of it. The doppelganger smiled, its eyes black and empty, its head tilting in that same eerie manner. It reached out, and Kayla felt an invisible force gripping her, pulling her closer. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her chest tightened, and her vision blurred. The last thing she saw before the light flickered out was the figure's smile, wide and cruel, as it whispered one word: "Stay." When the morning shift arrived, the store was empty. Kayla's apron lay on the floor, her radio blinking faintly. No one ever saw her again, but some nights the staff swore they heard faint whispers over the intercom and caught glimpses of a shadowy figure in the freezer aisle, its head tilted and its smile impossibly wide. The old diner on Route 13 was no stranger to ghost stories. Truckers passing through at odd hours often swapped tales about shadowy figures in cold spots. But for Amy, who had just started the night shift, those stories felt like harmless folklore, at least until the events of her first night. The clock above the counter ticked loudly in the silence. It was 2:07 a.m., and not a single customer had come through since midnight. Amy cleaned the counter for the third time, fighting the oppressive quiet. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting strange shadows on the black and white checkered floor. As she placed a freshly wiped coffee pot back on its burner, a faint knock echoed through the empty diner. Her head snapped toward the sound, the front door, but when she peered through the glass, no one was there. Shrugging it off as the wind, she turned back to her cleaning. But then the knock came again, this time louder, more deliberate. Amy's stomach tightened as she moved cautiously to the door. Outside, the highway stretched into darkness, illuminated only by the weak neon glow of the diner's sign. There was no one in sight. Just as she began to turn away, she noticed something peculiar. Fog had begun to roll in, thick and unnatural, creeping up to the edges of the parking lot. The knock came a third time, but it wasn't from the front door anymore. It was behind her. Amy froze. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she slowly turned around. The sound had come from the kitchen door at the back of the diner. Grabbing a heavy spatula from the counter, she crept toward it, her shoes squeaking faintly on the tile floor. The door swung open with a violent creak, slamming against the wall. The kitchen was dark, save for the flickering glow of a single overhead light. The pots and pans hanging on the rack swayed gently, clinking together as though disturbed by an unseen force. "Hello?" Amy called out, her voice trembling. No response. She stepped inside, her grip tightening on the spatula. The temperature dropped sharply, her breath misting in the cold. As she moved deeper into the kitchen, she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a trail of muddy footprints leading from the back door to the freezer. The footprints were too large to be human. Her hand trembled as she reached for the freezer handle. The trail ended here. Summoning every ounce of courage, she yanked the door open. It was empty. But as the door swung closed behind her, a strange sound filled the air. Labored breathing, raspy and wet, coming from just beyond the shelves of frozen goods. The breath grew louder, closer, as if circling her. Amy backed toward the door, but her hand grasped at empty air. The handle was gone. She turned, panic flooding her veins. The door was now a solid wall of ice, frost creeping toward her feet. A guttural growl rumbled from the darkness of the freezer, and a pair of glowing yellow eyes appeared in the black void. Amy screamed, slamming her fists against the frozen wall. It didn't budge. The growl grew louder, echoing off the metal walls as the thing in the darkness began to move. It was massive, its long limbs scraping against the shelves as it crawled closer. Just as its grotesque face came into view, a twisted blend of human and beast, The light in the freezer went out, and then everything was silent. When Amy woke, she was lying in the middle of the diner floor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the warmth had returned to the room. She sat up, her head spinning. The kitchen door was closed, and there was no sign of the creature, or the icy trap of the freezer. But something was wrong. The diner wasn't empty anymore. Sitting at the booths were shadowy figures, their forms indistinct and flickering like static on an old TV. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at her with blank, featureless faces. Amy stumbled to her feet, her breath hitching as she backed toward the counter. "What the hell is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure closest to her slowly raised a hand and pointed toward the clock. It was still ticking, but the hands were moving backward, faster and faster, spinning wildly until they stopped at 11:11. The diner's lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Amy's phone vibrated in her pocket, and she fumbled to pull it out. The screen glowed, displaying a single text message. "It's not over." The shadows began to move, slow at first, then faster, gliding across the floor without a sound. Amy turned and ran, bolting through the front door and into the foggy night. The highway was gone. In its place was an endless stretch of barren land, the diner now an isolated beacon in an ocean of nothingness. The fog coiled around her like a living thing, cold and suffocating. She screamed for help, but the sound was swallowed by the heavy silence, and then she heard it. The growl. Low and menacing, it echoed from every direction. She spun around, trying to locate its source, but the fog obscured everything. A shadow appeared in the mist, tall and misshapen. It was the same creature from the freezer, but now it was free, its glowing eyes fixed on her. Amy ran, her legs burning as the creature gave chase. Its footsteps were thunderous, shaking the ground beneath her. She tripped and fell, the cold mist wrapping around her like icy fingers. The last thing she saw before the creature descended on her was the diner, its neon sign flickering with two chilling words, "Help yourself." The next morning, the diner was empty. Amy's car was still in the parking lot, but there was no sign of her. The only clue left behind was the freezer door, now frosted shut, with claw marks etched deep into the metal. Locals say if you visit the diner at 11:11 p.m., you can still hear her screams, but no one stays long enough to find out what happens after. Sam hated his new night security job at the old Brookfield Hospital. The building had been abandoned for decades, its crumbling walls and shattered windows giving it a haunted look even in daylight. At night, under a pale moon, it was terrifying. But a paycheck was a paycheck, and Sam wasn't in a position to be picky. The first few nights had been uneventful. He'd patrol the halls, flashlight in hand, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Occasionally, he'd hear the wind rattling the broken glass or the distant skittering of rats, but nothing out of the ordinary. That changed on the fifth night. It started with the sound of faint whispers. Sam was doing his rounds on the third floor when he heard it, a soft murmuring coming from one of the patient rooms. He stopped, his flashlight trembling slightly as he aimed it toward the door. "Hello?" he called out. His voice sounded too loud, bouncing off the walls and making him flinch. The whispers stopped. Sam hesitated. The building was supposed to be empty. His boss had warned him that sometimes squatters sneaked in, and he was to call the police if he encountered anyone. Steeling himself, he stepped into the room. It was empty. The peeling wallpaper and rusted hospital bed gave it a macabre charm, but there was no sign of anyone. Still, the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on him. As he turned to leave, his flashlight flickered. "Come on, not now," he muttered, tapping it. The beam steadied, and that's when he saw it, something written on the wall in what looked like dried blood. 4 simple words, "You shouldn't be here." Sam stumbled back, his heart racing. He swore it hadn't been there when he entered. He spun around, half expecting someone to be standing behind him, but the room was still empty. His radio crackled, and he nearly dropped the flashlight. "Sam," a voice whispered through the static. "Who is this?" he demanded, pressing the button to reply. The static hissed louder, and the voice repeated, "Sam." He bolted out of the room, his heart hammering in his chest. The radio fell silent, and for a brief moment, so did the entire building. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing down the hallway behind him. Sam turned, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were getting closer. "Who's there?" he yelled, backing away. His voice quivered, and he hated how small it sounded in the vast, empty building. The footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening, the kind that made his ears ring. Then, from the end of the hall, he saw it. A shadow, tall and impossibly thin, standing completely still. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there like a dark smudge against the decayed walls. Sam's hand shook as he pointed the flashlight at it, but the beam didn't reveal anything. The shadow wasn't cast by a figure. It was just there, darker than the surrounding darkness. Without thinking, Sam turned and ran. His boots pounded against the cracked tiles as he sprinted down the stairs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't stop until he reached the security office on the first floor. Slamming the door shut, he locked it and leaned against it, trying to calm his racing heart. The room felt safe, surrounded by monitors that displayed grainy feeds from the hospital's cameras. He scanned the screens, hoping to spot whoever or whatever was in the building with him. But the hallways were empty. Then one of the monitors flickered. The feed from the third floor cut to static before revealing an image that made Sam's blood run cold. The camera was pointed at the room he had just left, and standing in the doorway was the shadow. It wasn't still anymore. It was moving toward the camera, its body bending and twisting unnaturally. Its limbs seemed too long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. As it moved closer, the camera feed began to distort, lines of static crawling across the screen. Then the shadow stopped, its head snapping to face the camera. It knew he was watching. The screen went black. Sam stumbled away from the monitors, his breathing ragged. The air in the office grew colder, and the lights above him flickered. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, a gentle tapping on the office door. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. The knock came again, louder this time. "Go away," he shouted, but his voice lacked conviction. The knock became pounding, shaking the door on its hinges. Sam backed away, his flashlight beam trembling as he aimed it at the door. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. The silence was worse. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. Sam's scream caught in his throat as the door creaked open. There was nothing there, just the empty hallway beyond. He approached cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. The hallway seemed endless now, stretching far beyond where it should have ended. At the far end, he saw the shadow again. It stood still, its head tilted, as if studying him. Then it started moving, gliding toward him silently. Sam turned and ran, his mind screaming at him to get out of the building. He burst through the main doors and into the night, gasping for air. The hospital loomed behind him, its broken windows like empty eyes watching him. He didn't stop running until he reached his car. Fumbling with the keys, he started the engine and sped away, leaving the cursed building in his rearview mirror. The next morning, Sam quit without explanation. The hospital remains abandoned, its shadowed halls silent and still. But every so often, locals claim they see a tall, thin figure in the windows, watching and waiting for the next unlucky soul to work the night shift. The graveyard shift at Harper's Rest Motel wasn't for the faint of heart. Perched on the edge of a desolate highway, the motel had a reputation for being unsettling. Guests often checked in and left before morning, spooked by strange noises or the oppressive silence that seemed to suffocate the place after dark. But for Josh, the job was easy money. All he had to do was man the front desk, clean up occasionally, and stay awake. It was just after 2 a.m. when the phone at the front desk rang. Josh nearly jumped out of his chair. It had been a quiet night, the kind where even the creak of the motel sign swaying in the wind felt deafening. "Harper's Rest Motel," Josh answered, trying to keep his voice steady. There was silence on the other end, not static or background noise, just pure, oppressive silence. "Hello?" he asked, a little louder. Then, barely audible, a voice whispered, "Room 6. Josh frowned. Room 6 was unoccupied. He glanced at the key rack behind him. Sure enough, the brass key for Room 6 hung there, swaying slightly, though there was no draft. "Who is this?" he demanded, but the line went dead. A chill ran down his spine. He hung up, telling himself it was just a prank, maybe some bored trucker pulling his leg, but his curiosity gnawed at him. Grabbing the flashlight from beneath the desk, he stepped outside. The night was bitterly cold, the wind biting at his face as he made his way to Room 6. The row of motel rooms looked eerily identical, their windows dark and lifeless. When he reached Room 6, he hesitated. The door looked wrong. It was slightly ajar, the latch hanging loosely, though he was certain he'd locked all the doors earlier. "Hello?" he called out, pushing the door open with his flashlight. The room was empty. The bed was untouched, the air stale with the faint scent of mildew. He stepped inside, sweeping the flashlight over the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt heavy, like the atmosphere before a storm. Then he noticed the bathroom door. It was closed, and a faint shadow moved underneath it. "Whoever's in there, this isn't funny," Josh said, his voice shaking as he approached. He reached out, his hand trembling, and pushed the door open. The bathroom was empty. The tiled walls were cracked and yellowed, the mirror spotted with grime. But as he turned to leave, he caught something in the corner of the mirror. Something that shouldn't have been there. A figure stood behind him, pale and gaunt, its hollow eyes locked on his. Its mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin, lips cracked and bleeding. Before he could turn around, the mirror shattered, shards flying outward and cutting into his face and arms. He stumbled back into the main room, clutching his bleeding cheek. His flashlight hit the floor, rolling to a stop as its beam illuminated the bed. That's when he saw it. A pair of pale, skeletal hands were gripping the edge of the mattress, slowly pulling a figure out from underneath. The thing that emerged defied logic. It was impossibly thin, its skin stretched tight over its bones, and its head tilted unnaturally to the side. Its hollow eyes never left him as it began to crawl toward him on all fours. Josh bolted, slamming the door behind him and sprinting back to the front desk. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as he locked the office door and grabbed the motel's landline phone. His hands shook as he dialed 911. The call connected, but the voice on the other end wasn't the dispatcher. "Room 6, the voice whispered, sending ice through his veins. Josh slammed the phone down, his heart pounding. He glanced at the security monitor on the desk. The grainy black and white feed showed the exterior of the motel rooms. Room 6's door was wide open, but the room was empty. Then, one by one, the cameras began to cut out. First room 6, then room 5, room 4. Each feed flickered before going dark, the shadowy figure moving closer with every frame. By the time the last camera, the one pointing at the office, flickered, it was too late. The door behind Josh creaked open. He didn't have time to scream. The next morning, the motel's new manager arrived to find the office empty, the front desk phone off the hook. The only sign of Josh was the flashlight lying on the floor of room 6, its beam flickering weakly, as if it had been dropped mid-sprint. Harper's Rest Motel remains open to this day, but no one stays in room 6 for long. Guests report strange whispers in the night and shadows that move where no one should be. And every so often, the front desk phone rings at 2 a.m., but when it's answered, the line is always dead. Evelyn was used to the night shift at Pine Hollow Care Facility. It was a small nursing home tucked deep in the woods, far from the noise of the city. Most nights were quiet, with only the occasional call light or restless resident to break the monotony. But one night, something happened that she would never forget. It began just after midnight. Evelyn was sitting at the nurse's station, sipping her coffee, when she noticed movement on the security monitor. The screen displayed grainy footage of the hallways, and in the corner of the West Wing camera, she saw a figure. She frowned. The West Wing had been closed for months due to renovations, and no one should have been there. She leaned closer, her coffee forgotten, as the figure moved slowly down the hallway. It was hard to make out details, but the shape was wrong, too tall, too thin, and it moved with an unnatural, jerky gait. Grabbing her flashlight, Evelyn told herself it was probably just a glitch in the system. But deep down, she knew she had to check it out. The hallways were dimly lit, the only sound the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. As she reached the door to the West Wing, she hesitated. The air here was colder, the kind of chill that seemed to seep into her bones. "Hello?" she called out, pushing the door open. The smell hit her first. It was damp, earthy, and faintly metallic, like decaying leaves mixed with rust. She stepped inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The hallway stretched ahead, its walls lined with plastic sheets and construction equipment. "Is anyone here?" she asked, her voice echoing eerily. She was met with silence. Halfway down the corridor, she heard it. A soft, wet sound, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. Her pulse quickened as she followed the noise, her footsteps hesitant. The sound led her to room 217, its door slightly ajar. Evelyn pushed the door open with trembling hands. The room was empty, save for an old hospital bed covered in a tattered sheet. But then her flashlight caught something on the wall, a smear of dark, wet streaks, too thick to be paint. Her stomach churned. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her. The sound was deafening in the confined space. Spinning around, she yanked on the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as she pounded on the door, shouting for help. That's when she heard it, breathing. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, ragged and shallow, as if coming from just inches away. Her flashlight flickered, and in the brief flashes of light, she saw something in the corner of the room. A figure crouched there, its limbs contorted and twisted like a broken marionette. Its face was obscured by a tangle of matted hair, but its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the weak light of her flashlight. It tilted its head, the movement sharp and unnatural, and let out a low, guttural growl. Evelyn stumbled back, her heart racing. The flashlight slipped from her hands, clattering to the floor. In the darkness, the breathing grew closer, accompanied by the soft scraping of nails or claws on the tile. "Please, no," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The door suddenly burst open, and she tumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. When she looked back, the room was empty. No creature, no blood on the walls, just the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. She didn't wait to investigate further. Evelyn sprinted back to the nurse's station, her hands shaking as she called the police. By the time they arrived, the West Wing was eerily quiet. The officers found nothing unusual, chalking her experience up to stress or exhaustion. But Evelyn knew better. Later that week, she learned the truth. Room 2217 had been closed long before the renovations. Decades earlier, a patient had died there under mysterious circumstances, their body found twisted and broken in the corner. Rumors swirled among staff about how the patient had spoken of something in the walls before their death, but no one had ever believed them. Evelyn quit the next day, leaving Pine Hollow behind for good. But every now and then, she dreams of that night, of the breathing, the glowing eyes, and the thing that had been waiting for her in the darkness. Working the night shift at the Rainview gas station wasn't the most glamorous job, but it paid the bills. Carter had taken the gig for some quick cash, thinking it would be an easy, boring few hours every night. But Rainview was far from ordinary. The station sat isolated on the edge of a dense forest, the nearest town a 20-minute drive away. The locals called it cursed. Carter didn't believe in curses, but by the end of his second week, he started questioning everything he thought he knew. The night it happened, the station was eerily quiet. Carter leaned on the counter, scrolling through his phone when the power flickered. The fluorescent lights buzzed and dimmed before stabilizing again. He glanced at the clock, 3:14 a.m. "Great," he muttered. Another blackout waiting to happen. As he put his phone down, something on the security monitor caught his attention. The cameras showed the station's interior and the lot outside, bordered by the dark line of the forest. On the screen, a figure stood just at the edge of the tree line. Carter squinted. The figure was hard to make out, partially obscured by shadows. It was tall, unnaturally so, and thin, with limbs that seemed too long. Its head was tilted, and its face, if it had one, was hidden by the darkness. "Is someone out there?" he said aloud, more to himself than anyone else. Grabbing a flashlight, he stepped outside. The air was still, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves. The lot was empty, save for a single car parked by Pump 3, its owner presumably in the restroom. Carter shone his light toward the forest. "Hello," he called. No response. The beam of his flashlight barely penetrated the dense wall of trees. He scanned the area one more time before heading back inside, shaking off the unease creeping up his spine. Back at the counter, Carter checked the monitor again. The figure was gone. Letting out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, he tried to focus on the clock. Just a few more hours, and he'd be home. But then the restroom door opened. A man stumbled out, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. His hands shook as he clutched at the counter. You need to call someone," the man stammered. "There's something out there." Carter's stomach dropped. "What do you mean? Did you see someone?" The man nodded, trembling. "Not someone. Something. It followed me here from the woods. It's waiting." Before Carter could respond, the power went out completely, plunging the station into darkness. The emergency lights kicked on, casting the room in a dim, flickering red glow. The man let out a strangled gasp and backed away from the glass doors. Carter followed his gaze. Outside, at the edge of the lot, the figure had returned. This time, it was closer. The weak red glow from the station illuminated it just enough to make Carter's stomach churn. The thing's limbs bent at odd angles, and its head was too large, its outline wrong in every conceivable way. "We have to leave," the man whispered, edging toward the door. "No," Carter hissed, grabbing his arm. "We're safer inside." The figure began to move. Its steps were slow and deliberate, but somehow it seemed to glide across the ground. Carter fumbled for the phone, but the line was dead. His cell phone had no service. The man whimpered, backing into the snack aisle. "It's not stopping," he whispered. The thing was now halfway across the lot. Carter grabbed a metal bat from behind the counter, his hands slick with sweat. He tried to calm his racing heart, telling himself it was just some prank, a kid in a costume trying to scare him. But deep down, he knew better. As the figure reached the glass doors, it stopped. For a moment, Carter dared to hope that it wouldn't come inside, but then it raised one impossibly long arm and tapped on the glass with a crooked finger. Tap, 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 tap. The sound echoed through the silent station. "Go away," Carter shouted, raising the bat. The thing didn't react. It just kept tapping, its movements slow and rhythmic. Then, without warning, the tapping stopped. It leaned forward, its face pressing against the glass. Carter's breath caught in his throat. The face, or what should have been a face, was a smooth expanse of pale flesh, featureless except for two deep, black pits where eyes might have been. The thing tilted its head as though studying him before it began to push against the glass. The door groaned under the pressure. Cracks spider-webbed across the glass, and Carter's panic boiled over. "Get back!" he screamed, swinging the bat wildly. The thing didn't flinch, its head tilting further as though amused. With a deafening crash, the glass shattered. The man in the snack aisle screamed, bolting toward the restroom. The creature stepped into the station, its limbs unfolding to an impossible height. Carter swung the bat again, but it passed straight through the thing's body as though it were made of smoke. "Stay away," he shouted, backing up toward the counter. The creature moved closer, its hollow eyes fixed on him. Carter tripped over a fallen bag of chips and hit the floor hard, the bat clattering out of reach. He scrambled backward, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely think. Then the lights flickered back on. The creature was gone. The station was silent, save for Carter's ragged breathing. The man from the restroom peeked out cautiously, his face pale and drawn. Is it over?" Carter didn't answer. He staggered to his feet, grabbed his keys, and bolted out the door. He didn't stop driving until he was miles away, the station a faint glow in his rearview mirror. The next day, the manager found the station in disarray, broken glass, scattered merchandise, and no sign of Carter or the man who had stopped by that night. Rainview gas station remains open, but locals avoid it after dark. Some say they've seen a tall, faceless figure lingering near the pumps, waiting for the next unlucky soul to work the night shift. Marissa had just started her new job as a night cleaner at the Holloway office complex, a 20-story building that loomed over the quiet downtown district. The job was straightforward: clean the offices, empty the trash, and leave before sunrise. She liked the solitude, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights, and the rhythmic task of vacuuming empty halls. But the quiet, she soon discovered, wasn't always comforting. On her third night, she arrived a little before midnight, her cleaning supplies rattling in the silence as she pushed the cart into the elevator. Her schedule was to start on the top floor and work her way down. The elevator dinged as it reached the 20th floor, and the doors slid open to reveal the dimly lit corridor. The air felt colder here. Marissa brushed it off as overactive air conditioning and wheeled her cart into the first office. It was the corner suite, with large windows overlooking the city. The room was immaculate, but as she emptied the trash and wiped down the desk, she noticed something odd. The office chair was spinning slowly. She stopped and stared at it. The chair had been still when she entered. She laughed nervously, chalking it up to air currents or maybe the slight vibration from the elevator. But as she turned to leave, she caught something in the reflection of the window. A figure. It was faint, almost translucent, standing behind her in the middle of the room. Her breath hitched, and she spun around, but the room was empty. The chair, however, had stopped spinning. Heart racing, she hurried out of the office and into the hallway, determined to finish her shift as quickly as possible. But the unease followed her. Every time she entered a new room, she felt like she was being watched. Shadows seemed to stretch and shift in the corners of her vision, and faint whispers tickled her ears, too soft to understand. By the time she reached the 15th floor, her nerves were frayed. She kept glancing over her shoulder, certain she wasn't alone. The hallway lights flickered as she approached the conference room. When she stepped inside, the air grew colder still, and she felt a pressure in her chest, as though the room itself was closing in on her. The long table was littered with papers and empty coffee cups, remnants of a late-night meeting. She began collecting the trash, but halfway through, the door slammed shut behind her. The sound reverberated through the room, making her jump. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. She tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Her pulse quickened as she banged on it, shouting for help. Then the lights went out. Marissa froze in the pitch black, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She fumbled for her flashlights, her hands shaking so badly it took her several tries to turn it on. The weak beam barely penetrated the darkness, but it was enough to illuminate the far end of the conference table. That's when she saw them. Shadowy figures, a dozen or more, standing motionless in a semicircle. Their faces were obscured, but their forms were distinct enough to make her blood run cold. They weren't solid. They seemed to flicker and shift, as if they were made of smoke, and they were all staring at her. She stumbled back, her flashlight dropping to the floor and rolling, casting erratic beams of light across the room. The shadows didn't move, but their presence was suffocating. She could feel their eyes, or whatever they had, boring into her. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Leave me alone." The figures began to move, gliding toward her without a sound. She pressed herself against the door, pounding on it with all her strength until suddenly it flew open and she tumbled into the hallway. The lights were back on. The air was still. She looked back into the conference room, but it was empty. No shadows, no papers on the table, nothing. Marissa didn't stop to question it. She abandoned her cart and bolted for the elevator, her footsteps echoing in the silence. When she reached the ground floor, she sprinted to her car and drove home, vowing never to return. The next morning, she called her supervisor and quit. She didn't care about the paycheck or the explanation. Nothing could make her step foot in that building again. Months later, Marissa heard rumors about the Holloway office complex. Employees spoke in hushed tones about strange occurrences at night, disembodied voices, flickering lights, and the feeling of being watched. Some even claimed to have seen figures standing in the windows after the building was supposed to be empty. The 20th floor in particular was said to be cursed. Years earlier, a fire had broken out during an all-night meeting, trapping a group of executives in the conference room. None of them survived. To this day, the building stands, its lights glowing faintly against the night sky. But the cleaning staff never stays past midnight, and no one dares to enter the 20th floor after dark. The weathered old diner sat at the edge of Route 46, a desolate stretch of roads surrounded by nothing but dark woods and whispers of ghost stories. For Casey, the overnight shift at Maggie's place was mostly uneventful. Truckers stopped in for coffee and locals swung by for a quick bite, but the hours between 2 a.m. and sunrise were often eerily quiet, except for that one night. Casey was wiping down the counter when the bell above the diner door jingled. She looked up, expecting the usual, a weary traveler or a night shift worker grabbing a late meal. Instead, a man stepped in, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. He was tall, with a slight limp, and his clothes were damp, as though he'd been walking in the woods. "Evening," Casey greeted him, forcing a smile. The man didn't respond. He shuffled to a booth in the far corner, his movements stiff and unnatural, and sat down. Casey grabbed her notepad and made her way over, her unease growing with every step. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly. The man didn't lift his head. "Just coffee," he said, his voice low and gravelly, as if unused for a long time. Casey nodded and hurried back to the counter. As she poured the coffee, she glanced at the man. He was sitting unnaturally still, his hands resting on the table, fingers twitching slightly. She set the cup on a tray and walked back to his booth. As she placed it in front of him, she noticed something strange. His fingers were caked with dirt, his nails cracked and jagged as though he'd been clawing at the ground. "Rough night?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. The man finally looked up, and Casey felt her stomach drop. His face was gaunt, his skin a sickly grayish hue. Dark circles framed his hollow eyes, and his lips were dry and cracked. He stared at her for a moment before giving a small, unsettling smile. "You could say that," he muttered. Casey backed away, her instincts screaming at her to leave him alone. She retreated to the counter, watching him from the corner of her eye. He didn't touch the coffee. Instead, he stared out the window, his lips moving as though whispering to himself. The diner grew colder, the air thick and heavy. Casey shivered, rubbing her arms as she glanced at the thermostat. It was set to its usual temperature, but the chill was undeniable. Then, the bell above the door jingled again. A second man entered, dressed in a deputy's uniform. Casey recognized him. It was Deputy Harris, a regular who often stopped by for pie during his patrols. Tonight, though, his face was pale, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by something grim. "Casey," he said urgently, his eyes darting toward the man in the booth. "Stay behind the counter." "What's going on?" she whispered, her heart pounding. Harris didn't answer. Instead, he approached the booth, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "Sir," he said, his voice steady but firm, "I'm going to need you to come with me." The man in the booth didn't move. Slowly, he turned his head toward Harris, his expression unreadable. "I just wanted some coffee," he said softly. "You shouldn't be here," Harris replied, his tone sharpening. "Stand up, now." Casey's eyes darted between the two men, the tension in the room so thick it was suffocating. The man in the booth let out a low chuckle, a sound that sent shivers down her spine. "I've already been where I'm supposed to be," he said cryptically, and then he stood. The movement was unnervingly fluid, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Casey gasped, her stomach lurching as she caught sight of his feet. They were bare and filthy, the soles bloodied and raw, as though he'd been walking on broken glass. "Stay back!" Harris shouted, drawing his gun. But the man didn't stop. He took a step forward, then another, his head tilting unnaturally as he stared at the deputy. "You can't stop me," he said, his voice echoing strangely, as though two people were speaking at once. Harris fired. The sound was deafening, and Casey screamed, ducking behind the counter. When she dared to peek over the edge, she saw Harris standing there, his gun shaking in his hands. The man hadn't fallen. He hadn't even flinched. The bullet hole in his chest was visible, dark and wet, but he simply smiled, his teeth unnaturally sharp. "You can't kill what's already dead," he whispered. Then, in a blur, he moved. Harris barely had time to react before the man was on him, his long fingers wrapping around the deputy's throat. Casey watched in horror as Harris was lifted off the ground, his feet kicking helplessly. The man's face twisted into something monstrous, his hollow eyes filling with blackness. Casey grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her fingers trembling so badly she nearly dropped it. But when she raised it to her ear, all she heard was static. The lights in the diner flickered and the cold deepened, her breath visible in the air. The bell above the door jingled again. Suddenly, the man dropped Harris, who crumpled to the floor, gasping for air. The strange figure turned toward the door, his blackened eyes narrowing. Casey followed his gaze and froze. A third figure stood in the doorway. This one was cloaked in shadows, its features indistinct but radiating an overwhelming sense of dread. The air grew heavier, pressing down on her chest like a physical weight. The shadow figure raised a hand, pointing at the man in the booth. "You were warned," it said in a voice that wasn't human. The man hissed, his form beginning to distort and flicker, his limbs stretched, his body convulsing as though something inside him was tearing him apart. With a final, guttural scream, he dissolved into a swirl of black mist that vanished through the cracks in the floor. The shadow figure turned toward Casey, and for a brief moment she thought she would die, but it simply stared at her, as though assessing her, before fading into the night. The diner was silent, save for Harris's ragged breathing. He stumbled to his feet, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. "You didn't see that," he said hoarsely. "None of this happened." Casey nodded numbly, too shaken to argue. She quit the next day, leaving the diner behind. But sometimes, late at night, she dreams of the man in the booth, his sharp teeth and black eyes and the figure that came to claim him. Route 46 remains as desolate as ever, and the locals still tell stories about Maggie's place. They say that if you stop by after midnight, you might see a man sitting in the far corner, waiting for something or someone to take him back to where he belongs. The sleepy hospital at the edge of town always felt unnerving at night. Sarah, a nursing assistant, had been working the graveyard shift for months, but the isolation of the job never quite sat right with her. The long, empty hallways seemed to stretch forever, illuminated by the pale glow of fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. The patients on the fourth floor were all elderly, recovering from surgeries or illnesses. Sarah was used to their quiet murmurs, the sound of oxygen machines, and the occasional call light. But there was one room, room 428, that no one liked to go into unless absolutely necessary. The stories among the staff were endless. Patients reported seeing someone sitting in the corner of the room at night, someone who didn't belong. They described a woman in a hospital gown, her face gaunt and hollow, who would whisper strange things in the darkness. The patients who stayed in room 428 often deteriorated quickly despite being stable before. Nurses joked nervously about the room curse, but Sarah didn't believe in ghosts or curses. That changed on a stormy November night. The hospital was unusually quiet, the halls silent except for the occasional beep of a monitor or the rumble of thunder outside. Sarah was making her rounds, checking on patients and adjusting IV drips. When she reached room 428, she hesitated. Mrs. Whitaker, the current occupant, had been admitted for a routine recovery after hip surgery. Sarah peeked in, and the elderly woman was lying on her side, facing the window. The heart monitor beside her beeped steadily, a reassuring sign. "Mrs. Whitaker?" Sarah whispered, stepping into the room. The old woman didn't respond. Sarah moved closer, intending to adjust her blanket. That's when she noticed it, a faint outline in the reflection of the window. It looked like someone was sitting in the chair in the corner of the room, but when Sarah turned her head, the chair was empty. Her pulse quickened, but she shook it off. Fatigue, she told herself. Just your imagination. She leaned over to tuck the blanket around Mrs. Whitaker when the woman suddenly grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. Sarah yelped, nearly dropping the clipboard in her hand. "Did you see her?" Mrs. Whitaker rasped, her eyes wide with terror. "She's here." Sarah tried to calm her, gently prying the woman's fingers off her wrist. "Mrs. Whitaker, there's no one here but me," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "She's in the corner," Mrs. Whitaker whispered. "She's watching us." Sarah glanced back at the chair, her stomach twisting. It was still empty. She quickly pressed the call button, summoning another nurse, and stayed with Mrs. Whitaker until Linda, her colleague, arrived. "What's going on?" Linda asked, her tone weary. "Mrs. Whitaker's upset," Sarah explained, avoiding mentioning the eerie reflection or the woman's frantic claim. Linda nodded and stayed with the patient while Sarah continued her rounds, her nerves still buzzing. Hours later, long past midnight, Sarah found herself walking down the dim hallway again. She avoided looking at room 428, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier, and the hairs on her arms prickled as she passed the door. Then she heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping. She froze. It sounded like fingernails against glass, coming from room 428. Against her better judgment, she pushed the door open slightly and peeked inside. The room was dark except for the glow of the heart monitor. Mrs. Whitaker was asleep, but the tapping continued. It was coming from the window. Sarah's mouth went dry. The fourth floor was far too high for anyone to be outside. She stepped into the room, her hands shaking as she approached the window. The tapping stopped. She stared at the glass, her own pale reflection staring back. For a moment, nothing happened. But then another face appeared, just behind her own. Hollow eyes, sunken cheeks, and lips twisted into a grotesque smile. Sarah screamed and spun around, but the room was empty. The chair in the corner, though, had moved. It was no longer neatly positioned by the table, but turned toward the bed as though someone had been sitting there. Linda burst into the room, alarmed by the scream. "Sarah, what happened?" Sarah couldn't speak, her chest heaving as she pointed toward the chair. Linda frowned and walked over, inspecting it. "It's just a chair," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Sarah didn't finish her shift. She went home, trembling, and called in sick the next night. The following day, Sarah learned that Mrs. Whitaker had passed away unexpectedly during the night. The doctors couldn't explain it. Her vitals had been stable, and she had shown no signs of distress. But Sarah knew. Room 428 had claimed another victim. Weeks later, the room was sealed off for renovations. No one dared to ask why the hospital administration had made the decision, but rumors swirled among the staff. Some said they'd heard laughter coming from the empty room late at night. Others claimed they saw shadowy figures moving behind the frosted glass of the door. Sarah quit her job shortly after, unable to shake the image of that face in the window. To this day, The fourth floor of the hospital remains a source of dread, and room 428 is a whispered warning for new staff. Never look at the corner after dark.